And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Thank you for joining us today on the aviation portion of your broadcast. I'm meteorologist Emily Niebuhr. Let's take a look at your satellite conditions to start off with. Currently, you can see we have trough moving across much of the area and has been moving eastward towards the Bristol Bay area and inland. We had, again, that trough moving in towards Anchorage. For your Friday morning, we're going to be having a second low moving in across the Bering. Because of that, we're going to have generally low visibilities and low ceilings across much of the Bering. Again, red denotes IFR conditions, instrument flight rule conditions, which means that conditions are going to be more challenging for pilots with lower visibilities and lower ceilings. So you can see across, due to that trough, we are going to be having lower conditions of visibility across much of the Kuskokwim into some parts of the Bethel area and up towards Stewart Peninsula. So much of the Bering West Coast is going to be having challenging flying weather in terms of visibilities, even into the Gulf of Alaska. Meanwhile, across much of the interior, we are going to be seeing fairly decent flying conditions for visibility on your Friday morning. By the afternoon hours, there's some improvement due to some of that mixing out by the sun. And so we're going to be looking at MVFR conditions across portions of much of the Seward Peninsula. But again, along the coastal areas, we are expecting lower visibilities and ceilings. For your Saturday morning, again, these systems are going to be moving slowly, and the low-pressure system is going to be dominant across much of the Bering. So expect lower visibilities into your Saturday morning. Similar conditions across much of the Gulf of Alaska. We do have, in the Panhandle, we are expecting more MVFR, more marginal conditions for your Saturday. For your Saturday afternoon, again, conditions are going to be fairly persistent. Good visibilities across much of the interior Alaska, but again, across the Bering and along the Bering Sea coast of Alaska, we are looking at lower visibilities. Let's take a look at your thunderstorm outlook for Friday. We are expecting some thunderstorms across much of the interior and along the border with the Yukon. So if you're flying in those areas, fly with caution and keep up to date on your latest weather information. For your passes for Friday, for Anaktuvik Pass, we are expecting conditions to start out at MVFR, but improve to VFR by the afternoon hours. Aitken Pass, similar story. Start out with MVFR, marginal conditions with improving towards VFR by the afternoon. For Lake Clark and Merrill, we are expecting conditions to mainly be in VFR for your Friday. Again, as we're expecting through much of our interior locations on Friday, VFR conditions in Rainy Pass as well. Same story as we go towards Windy Pass. Isabel Pass, we're expecting VFR conditions for your Friday as well. Mentasta, again, great Friday for fly in terms of visibility, VFR conditions. Tahitian Pass, VFR conditions as well. Portage will remain in VFR conditions for much of your Friday. Friday, again, we're going to start out with VFR conditions, but a slight deterioration towards MVFR conditions towards the afternoon hours. Let's take a look at your freezing levels. Again, we're looking at some warm air coming in towards the Bering, freezing levels up to 14,000 feet as you go towards the central Aleutian Islands. 12,000 feet across much of the Bering, slightly cooler air in interior. And so we're expecting, again, pretty good freezing levels across much of the state of Alaska. For your Friday, in terms of icing, we're only expecting that to be a risk in a few areas due to that weak trough system. Again, orange denotes considerable and moderate, so that's towards the eastern Aleutian Islands for icing. Okay, this is mostly going to be above 14,000 feet. Again, as we showed, the temperatures are pretty warm in the Bering right now. Also, a few isolated areas of icing possible on mountains with that weakening trough, and also a little bit along the border with Canada. However, we could see maybe a few pockets of icing in some of those thunderstorms. Let's look at your jet stream at 30,000 feet. I got a pretty decent jet, about 100 knots up again, high in the atmosphere. We also have this separate jet, much weaker, about 45 knots across the eastern Bering. And finally, we have a jet in the Gulf of Alaska of about 90 knots. As we go lower in the atmosphere, those jets obviously weaken. We do have one jet that's about 35 knots that's along the Gulf of Alaska, flowing northwards. We again have that separate jet associated with that low moving into the Bering of about 60 knots just south of the Aleutian Islands. And as we go to about 3,000 feet, again, we're looking at winds of up to about 50 knots across the Aleutian Islands, and north Aleutian Islands about 35 knots. So, and as we go towards the Gulf of Alaska, then that jet is much weaker, about 25 knots at 3,000 feet. As a result, this is where we're expecting most of our turbulence. We're expecting considerable moderate turbulence at surface to 4,000 feet along the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula, and surface to 4,000 in interior portions of Alaska as well.